All right, where are we at, Dan, this week?
All right. So we did Genesis 1, 2, and 3 last week. So we're starting out with 4 and we're going to do 4 and 5, and then we'll get to 6 next week. Near the end, we'll explain why that needs a hole. All right. So
well, let's do a preview of the topics before we get into it.
Why not?
Okay, so far the topics for this week, verse 3:1, the talking serpent and the problem of everlasting life and how it relates to other ancient Near Eastern texts. God killing animal for their skins. What is the meaning of, with the help of the Lord, I brought forth a man? In 4:10, what is the meaning of, the voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground? What is the nature of the mark?
Right.
Is it possible to know? Questions about the land of Nod. He lived in Nod, which apparently means wandering.
Right.
A little on the nose. There's some questions about Cain's wife. I think this is a common one. This comes up a lot. 4:17, we get introduced to Enoch, right?
Yeah.
What does it mean that if Cain was avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times? Adam made love to his wife again. We're going to talk about making love, apparently.
Apparently.
Okay. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image. We're going to talk about the imagery of image.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Enoch walked faithfully with God, and then he was no more. What does that mean? And then, is there a significance to Lamech living for 777 years? We're going to hit all those things.
Yep.
Anything in addition to that?
I'm sure we'll find a lot of things along the way.
There will be some side trails. All right, Dan, without further ado, how about we step right into the very first topic?
Yeah.
All right, the talking serpent and the problem of everlasting life. So I wanted to briefly cover some of the Gilgamesh tablets. Do you know the story of Gilgamesh?
Of course.
And what do you know?
He was like a mythological figure.
Sure.
Larger than life. He had something to do with the flood, didn't he?
Yeah.
Oh, see?
Yeah,
I did read about this. And then he had a friend who had to fight. And then they fought each other. And then they became best friends.
That's exactly it, yeah.
Yeah, so
you know quite a bit, okay.
I do.
Yeah, Gilgamesh was a very historical figure, kind of like Moses or any of the other very, very large mythological. Well, Moses is not largely mythological, but we would assume he was real. Nevertheless, he is one of the largest figures in Babylonian religion that wasn't a full-on god.
Mm.
So in the story of Gilgamesh, he does at one point, after his friend Enki dies, he goes to look for something that would give him the opportunity to become like the gods and to have everlasting life.
Mm.
We briefly discussed last week the problem in ancient Near Eastern mythology of people wanting to be like the gods and the gods wanting to prevent that.
Right.
And so we'll see a little bit of that in the story of Gilgamesh and the serpent. Nevertheless, he crosses the water of death to find the only human in recorded history to have found the way to becoming immortal.
Oh.
So he can question him about how he can become immortal just like him. Utnapishtim, he is the Noah figure of the Babylonian flood story. So he survived the Great Flood, and he was credited with immortality. Nevertheless, Gilgamesh does find his way, and then he is told about a secret plant that can give him immortality. Unfortunately, a serpent ruins it.
Wait, a serpent ruins it in the Gilgamesh story?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
So we're going to read a snippet from Gilgamesh.
Yeah, the more you tell me,
It's not a direct borrowing, but the concepts are similar.
Yeah.
Gilgamesh said to him, to Utnapishtim, the far away, as I look upon thee, Utnapishtim, thy features are not strange, even as I art thou. So he's recognizing that even though he's an immortal, he's also human. Thou art not strange at all, even as I art thou. My heart had regarded thee as resolved to do battle, yet thou liest indolent upon thy back. Tell me, how joinest thou the assembly of the God in the quest of life? The assembly of the gods, I apologize. And we talked last week about the assembly of the gods, how that notion is carried over into the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. So here Gilgamesh is just asking him, how did you find your place among the assembly of the gods, the children of God? He responds, I will disclose, O Gilgamesh, a hidden thing. A secret of the gods I will tell thee. This plant, like the buckthorn, is, and then unfortunately what's after that is missing from the tablet. So we missed a small portion of the story, but it carries on. Its thorns will prick thy hands, just as does the rose. If thy hands obtain the plant, thou wilt find new life. No sooner had Gilgamesh heard this than he opened the water pipe. He tied heavy stones to his feet. They pulled him down into the deep, and he saw the plant. It would be helpful to give the backstory. He's still just finished crossing the waters of death.
Oh, okay.
So he's still just above the waters of death when he's questioning Utnapishtim. Anyways, they pulled him down to the deep, and he saw the plant. He took the plant. Though it pricked his hands, he cut the heavy stones from his feet. The sea cast him up on its shore. Gilgamesh says to him, to Urshanabi, I apologize, the boatman. Gilgamesh had a boatman that took him across the river, the waters of death. Urshanabi, this plant is a plant apart, whereby a man may regain his life's breath. I will take it to ramparted Uruk. He's referring to the temple at this point. Then it carries on, it says, its name shall be, man becomes young in old age. I myself shall eat it, and thus return to the state of my youth. After 20 leagues, they broke off a morsel. After 30 further leagues, they prepared for the night. Gilgamesh saw a well whose water was cool. He went down into it to bathe in the water. A serpent snuffed the fragrance of the plant. It came up from the water and carried off the plant. Going back, it shed its slough. Thereupon Gilgamesh sits down and weeps, his tears running down over his face. In other ancient Near Eastern mythology, the arch enemy, really, of everlasting life seems to always be a serpent of some nature. In Ugaritic mythology, we hear about the Leviathan, what they called the Lotan. And in the end of the Canaanite mythology, the Leviathan is defeated. But here it says, when you smite Lotan, the fleeing serpent, finish off the twisting serpent, the close, coiling one with 7 heads. The heavens wither and go slack like folds of your tunic. Then I, with groans, am devoured. Like a piece of dung I lie. So you must for your part descend into the throat of Motu, son of Ilu, into the watery depths of the beloved warrior of Ilu. This is a small part of the Baal cycle where Baal is descending into the underworld, into the watery depth where the Leviathan and the god we refer to as Ma'at in Hebrew would reside, which is the god of death, which is also the translation into Hebrew for death. But in the end, the serpent is killed and death is essentially defeated, not unlike Christian mythology where it says it is notable, this is my writing, it is notable that most Jewish and Christian mythology ends with the destruction of the serpent and the waters of chaos, as we read in Revelation 22. And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil, and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. The many problems of the serpent that we find in the Bible also resurfaces in all of the ancient Near Eastern cultures. This is not a unique to the Bible situation.
And for anybody else who's out there watching, if you didn't really understand any of what he said, that's fine. Neither did I. but we'll get there.
Yeah, it's hard because I know all the names of the people in the story and like the locations, but if you don't know if you've never read the stories before.
I mean, the only thing I really take away from this is what we talked about last week about how much of, the first, let's say, 11 chapters of Genesis were not really meant to be true, but instead were meant to mirror previous mythologies, right?
Yeah, I think part of it was tapping into common imagery, things that people would have accepted as true, not necessarily as mythology, and then they mixed it with their mythology to fill in the gaps. So most people would have thought that the Leviathan was real, not mythological. So to them, it was completely real. But when they start discussing issues that they don't fully have answers to, like how the world was created,
right,
that's where you have to start mixing in theology with what you think is hard science. So they would have completely believed Leviathan, deities, all this stuff was hard science to them. We call it religion. To them, it was very real. And they thought they could test it. They thought there was a means by which these things could be tested, and so they felt that as though they were true.
Okay.
Should we move on to
yeah, let's do it.
Move on to 321?
Yeah.
So what do we have in 321, Dan?
Let's see. So this is right after Adam and Eve were caught, sinning. They ate the fruit and all that, and they noticed that they were naked.
Sure.
And God actually, it says right here, he made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them, which is great, except for one thing.
Sure.
I assume there wasn't any death prior to this happening. I mean, these animal skins probably came from animals. So did God kill the animals? Was that all right for him to do? Was that the first sacrifice, offering, what have you?
Yeah, it's generally accepted, at least among the people I've spoken to, that God killed the first animals. Yeah, I've got here in my translation, unto Adam also and to his wife did the Lord God make coats of skin and clothe them. I think to the ancient reader, this would make perfect sense. The animals were given as being subservient to mankind and not worthy of being companions to mankind. That's why God made Eve, because the animals were not appropriate companionship.
Right.
And so the animals perhaps just didn't have enough value and status to matter.
I don't know. It's just, people talk about before there was sin that all animals must have been vegetarians. Do you believe that one?
Yeah, I've heard that a lot. And one of the interesting things is it seems conflicting because we're told at the end when there's a new heaven and new earth, the lion will lie down with the lamb, and there won't be any carnivorous prey left on the earth. But it seems problematic to me in that some of these animals seemed only designed to eat other animals.
Yeah.
It looks to me like death is baked into the DNA of these animals. It's hard to envision God creating a lion or a tiger just to nibble on the berries. You know what I mean? They're specifically designed for a purpose. So it seems to me that the death of the animals is somewhat by design. I could be wrong. It just seems that way.
Here's a crazy question. So Adam and Eve were immortal in the garden. Were the animals?
Well, they were immortal as long as they were able to partake of the tree of life.
Right.
Yeah.
So the animals would have still died, I presume?
So that's the question, right? Before they sinned, were the animals and were Adam and Eve was the original plan to have them to be immortal? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think a lot of Christian theologians, especially the Calvinists, would have a problem with that view. They would say, no, it was always in God's long-term plan to sacrifice his son to atone for mankind, which he knew would be imperfect.
Mm.
But obviously for an open theist, that would be highly problematic. They would say that, well, no, God's original plan was for Adam and Eve to not have committed the sin, right, and to still be dwelling in God's presence. And so what happens after that is all contingencies. And there is no meta narrative necessarily from the beginning. God is in a divine union with mankind, reacting to the free will of mankind in order to bring about the ends that he wishes to see.
So, just going back to 21, would you say that, it's not included here, but would you say that the killing of the animals for the skins was the first sacrifice, atonement for sins, for Adam and Eve's sins?
That's a great question. I don't think the answer is yes, though.
No?
No, I think it's interesting that God was the first character in the Bible to kill an animal.
Right.
But the purpose of sacrificing an animal was necessarily an act of worship to the Creator, as well as in primitive times an act of sustaining the deity.
Right.
The one thing that I find unappealing about this passage is I feel though the killing of the animal was unnecessary.
Right. I mean, he could have used leaves, right? And in fact, I feel like all the, illustrations always show leaves. Right. I don't know if they've ever shown animal skins.
Right.
That's why I was so surprised here,
Yeah, it's surprising. And you think a creator with unlimited power and knowledge surely could come up with a system of clothing that didn't require the killing of an animal. Maybe there's a greater purpose. Maybe this is baked into the cycle of life and creation as a reminder to mankind that there is a cycle of life. But I would have to assume Adam and Eve were unaware of these concepts at the time.
Right.
And it would be kind of an irrelevant demonstration. Yeah. Anyways, let's move on.
Yeah.
Let's move on to 4:1, shall we?
Yeah, they're not all going to be clear-cut answers, huh?
Yeah. Well, why did they need clothes at all, right?
Right.
Why not to be naked? I guess the Bible view is that there's something inherently wrong about nakedness, right? But
knowing you're naked.
From a modern perspective, I think a lot of people would disagree with that, especially people from really hot tropical climates who barely wear any clothes.
Yeah, but they still wear something.
Something. Yeah. But it definitely brings up an interesting discussion is what is the nature, what is the mechanism by which that nakedness is deemed to be inherently bad or sinful? You know what I mean? And it seems to me from the biblical narrative that it's inherently bad, but they were just unaware of it until their eyes were opened.
Okay, yeah.
Which means God created something that was inherently bad, had Adam and Eve in that inherently bad scenario, unaware of that thing. But then when they became aware because of the knowledge, well, then they had to cover it up. But was it bad before they knew it was bad? And if so, then did God not create them to be inherently sinful beings?
That's quite a question. I'm sure a lot of people would have to disagree with that one, right?
Right, but it's something something that is worth asking. But let's not do a whole episode on Adam and Eve being naked.
Right. Yeah.
Let's talk about them having sex.
All right, a little different.
Yeah.
All right. So this is, let's see.
4:1, right?
4:1. Adam made love to his wife Eve.
Sure, and she became pregnant, right?
Yeah.
Gave birth to Cain.
With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the question here, if I understand it, is what is the meaning of with the help of God?
Right, yeah.
Is this like a Holy Spirit conception situation?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Or is this an idiom of gratitude?
Right, yeah. I mean, I presume they weren't giving birth in the Garden of Eden, right?
Right.
And
Well, it seems from the story at the moment
I mean, I
that
know
they had
when-
been expelled, and yeah, I guess they're giving birth outside of the garden.
Yeah. I mean, I know when, God said that now your pregnancies are going to hurt and all that.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I mean, they hadn't. The assumption is they would have nothing to compare it to because
Right.
they hadn't been. But then again, why would God have said that then?
Right.
If they had nothing to compare it to anyhow. So I don't really know. I mean, I guess in a way, it's probably just Eve saying, "Hey, thanks, I got a kid." It's a blessing.
Yeah. Actually, I think you're right. I did go back and do the Hebrew translation for this, and it looks to me like a case of poor English translating. It's not, again, when I say that, is I don't want to criticize biblical translators because there are a lot of ambiguous passages, and the goal of the translation typically is to make something that is difficult in Hebrew, make it readable in English. And the literal translation in Hebrew is, I have acquired a man from Yahweh. The problem is the preposition to and from or with is a little bit blurry here. So in Hebrew, typically we have a way of saying from somebody, so on and so forth. Here it doesn't actually say that. It just says, I have acquired a man from Yahweh. There's no indication here that it's saying with Yahweh or with the help of Yahweh or with the assistance of Yahweh. So I think the English translator are assuming that it says, I've acquired a man from Yahweh as just a phrase saying that the Lord is the mechanism in which helped me to come to this point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but it sounds more like God had a hand in it than just them having sex, So I'm not really sure.
Right. It does seem that way, but it is super common for the childbirthing to be credited to God. And how many times in the Old Testament we hear about the Lord opening somebody's womb so that they can become pregnant and then have a child. Or someone who was barren, like Samson's parents, or Hannah, who then were able to give birth. And then, of course, that birth was credited as a miracle to God. So I think here, it's, like you said at the beginning, it really seems to be an expression of gratitude. And I think you're right.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we need to go to the point of immaculate conception here.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Not yet.
Especially since we're talking about Cain.
Right, yeah.
To assume that there was an immaculate conception of Cain seems completely unnecessary.
Right.
But then Cain kills his brother.
Yep.
And we've got the issue of Cain's brother's blood.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, can you read this for us?
Yeah. Let's see. The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground."
That's right.
Now listen to this. I hadn't even thought about this before, but I was reading this, and I mean, it could just be poetic language, but crying to me from the ground, that makes it seem as though Abel is, not still alive, but somewhere. You know what I mean? He's not didn't just vanish, disappear. His soul is just nowhere. It's gone.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if this is a very early sign that there is an afterlife of some sort,
Yeah. I think at the time this was written, there's definitely a conception of an afterlife. We would call it Sheol. it's not necessarily a heaven or a hell. It's just kind of a mundane afterlife existence where you're in the earth and the dust is your food. It's not pleasant, but there's a little more to it, because here we're talking specifically about the blood crying out from the ground, which of course is where it would seep into, had your blood been spilled. And of course, blood is considered to be the life force just behind the breath of God. So in the Bible, it says that the life is in the blood. And we're going to read a couple passages here. In Leviticus 17:11.
Yeah, ready? For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life.
Yeah. And then the blood is considered the most polluting of all substances. The question is, what is it polluting? And here is the ground. It's not because blood is a polluted device itself. It's because innocent blood is a perversion of that life. And when it becomes part of God's holy ground, it pollutes God's holy ground. So consequently, unatoned for murders pollute the Holy Land and make it unfit for the divine presence. To prevent such a catastrophe, the cities of refuge were established in Numbers 35, Deuteronomy 19. In cases where murder could not be traced, a rite prescribed in Deuteronomy 21:19 had to be carried out. Because man is made in God's image, homicide must be avenged. That's Genesis 9:5. Here, Abel's blood is pictured crying to God for vengeance. It's a desperate cry of men without food, like what we see in Genesis 41:55. Or someone crying out expecting to die in Exodus 14:10, or even those who are oppressed by their enemies, as we see in Judges 4:3. Nevertheless, the blood spilt on the ground, the defiling of the ground, is actually the reason why the Canaanites were removed, right? If you look at the Old Testament reasoning, why the Canaanites had to be removed from the land by the Israelites, one of the chief complaints in the Old Testament is that they've polluted God's land, and so the land is literally spitting them out. So here, the pollution of the land with innocent blood seems to be the biggest issue here for Cain.
Which is great, but I honestly don't care about that.
Oh, you want to know if it harkens back to a heaven or a hell?
Right, yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Sorry, I misunderstood your whole thing and went down that diatribe.
That's fine.
It does. Yeah, absolutely. There was a conception that Cain, when he killed Abel, the Abel would be in some sort of existence. It certainly wouldn't have been a pleasant existence, but he would still be alive.
You keep saying that, this is what they had thought.
Right.
Am I able to read this and actually take it that there was a heaven or what have you? Or is this, again, just what the people believed? You know what I mean?
Well, it's hard to know because we're talking about what the Bible says versus what we know from science, right? And what we know from science seems to be different. They believe that heaven was in the skies, and that even when Jesus came back, they still believed that. They thought we would meet Jesus in the sky, in the heavenly abode. The Hebrew word for the sky is literally Hashemayim. It means heavens.
So there's no real proof in this that heaven exists, just proof that they believed it existed as they were writing it.
This is definitely proof that they believed in an afterlife. I wouldn't call it heaven, though. We refer to it as Sheol or the pit. And it was similar to Greek mythology, where the fate of all souls ultimately led.
I mean, this only tells me that they believed in it, That's all that it does, right?
Yeah.
So it's worthless to me.
Yeah, we hear a little bit about them later on in the prophets. We read about those great leaders who have died and now are in Sheol, referred to as the Raphaim. They show up in the Old Testament quite a bit.
And they think they're there for eternity?
Yeah.
You live for however many years they lived at this time.
At this time period, yeah.
And then that's it.
They believed it was for eternity.
For eternity, you were just eating dust.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't until a couple hundred years before Jesus that people began to really take hold of the idea that those who had passed away would be resurrected to new life, and that there would be a renewed heaven and renewed earth.
And is it true that the Jewish people, even today, don't believe in an afterlife? I don't know if that's true. I certainly heard that somewhere, though.
It is certainly a spectrum of belief among the Jewish people. So
Okay.
just like with a lot of things that the Christians believe, they would ask us, do you believe in this? Do you believe in that? And we would say, well, it depends on what denomination you're a part of. Certainly there's a number of Jewish sects that believe in certain things like heaven and hell, and some that don't. So it would depend.
Can you imagine being Jewish and not believing in an afterlife? I almost feel like, what's the point, you know?
I think a lot of them do. Yeah, that's been my experience.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that the Jewish people have the same conception of the afterlife as the Christian people, where there's angels floating around and playing harps, singing worship music to God, things like that. I don't think that's part of the conception. I think the Jewish vision of heaven is more or less a renewed earth.
I mean, that's what we think too, right?
That's what we're supposed to think.
Oh.
There's mixed views in the New Testament, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
It's not clear. That's why we're still arguing about it 2,000 years later.
Right.
If all the New Testament writers were perfectly clear on what it was going to be like, we wouldn't be here discussing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we're going to definitely get into Sheol, the nature of Sheol, what it meant to be there.
Mm-hmm.
David writes about it. The prophets write about it. It's all over the Old Testament. We're going to hit Sheol for sure.
Okay.
Let's move on to 4:15.
Yeah.
And speculate about the Mark of Cain, what it could and could not have been.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the Scarlet Letter.
Sure.
And from what I understand, they never mentioned in the book what the letter was. You can assume it was an A for adultery, but they never say that. And it really makes me think of this, you know.
Sure.
So, like, what is the mark? How would people see it and go, oh, I better not mess with him?
Right.
You know, I don't get that part.
Yeah. Well, I think unfortunately, even though we are going to speculate for sure, I don't know if there's an answer.
Well, sure. I don't know if there's an answer for any of this.
Right.
This is all speculation, right?
Right.
Till we die.
Absolutely. I was partially convinced a while back by a scholar named Klaus Westermann that something interesting might be in the text, and that maybe he didn't actually mark Cain's. We think of having a body, like a mark on his body, like a tattoo or a scar.
Okay.
And I think that's the most commonly held view, especially because we see something similar in Ezekiel 9:4-6, where there are markings on the forehead of the people.
Okay.
But interestingly enough, in the Genesis story with Cain,